And I'm here to testify today that it was an extraordinary experience for me, and there aren't that many things about which you can say it really changed my life. It changed the way I looked at the world. I was at lunch in Manhattan, a very urban gathering, and somebody said, apropos of nothing, the warblers will be coming through the park soon. It was March, and nobody listened to him, and I leaned over and I said, "What are warblers?" He said, "Oh, they're neotropical migrants." Thank you very much. I loved the word neotropical, but I had absolutely no idea what it meant. And I said, "What's that?" He said, "They're tiny, beautiful birds from Central America or South America, and they will be passing through the equivalent of your backyard." And as soon as he said it, I knew I would go out and find them, and I took a class, a very basic class at the Audubon Society, and we went on field trips, and really after that, everything was different. These are my daughters sharing a pair of binoculars. I promised I'd put them in. We'll move right along. This is a cerulean, make sure it's still, yeah. This is a cerulean warbler. It's one of the neotropical migrants that you can find in Central Park. Not that often. It's fallen on hard times, and it's a hard bird to see anyway. And every year in the park, every spring, I always wanted to see a cerulean warbler. I'd somehow managed to see almost all the possible eastern warblers you could see, but every birder has what he calls a grail bird. It doesn't have to be an exotic bird, but it's the bird, for whatever reason, you just miss. You know, you go to the park and someone says, "Did you see the cerulean yesterday?" And you say, "No." But then a couple of years ago, I went into the park. I went to Tanner Spring, which is this place I love. It's right near the Diana Ross Playground and not that far from the Museum of Natural History. And there was Cal Vornberger, the photographer who took that egret taxi photo with his huge lens and his tripod. And he said, "Did you see the cerulean warbler?" And I said, "No." "Where is it?" Thinking he would tell me it was in the wooded interior of the park. And he said, "Oh, it's at 100 West 89th Street. And so I said, "Really, is there a phone number?" You know, I'd never been given a street address for a bird. But he said, no, really, it's in a tree in front of a building. And, you know, run, don't walk, because it's been there a long time. So I did run, although I'm not a grand lister, or twitcher, as the British call them. And look at the bird. You can see why I wanted to see it. And I got there. Inconsiderately, it had moved a little down the street, but I found it in a very tall tree. And as you heard, planting trees, even on side streets, makes a difference. Some of you may recognize this bird because it's on the cover of Jonathan Franzen's new novel, Freedom. And in that novel, somebody becomes obsessed with saving the cerulean warbler. And in the process, he kind of destroys himself and his family, and he makes a deal with the kind of horrible corporation that removes the tops of mountains that have promised a little piece of land, and basically everything falls apart. The balance is totally lost. And surely there are dire elements, of course, in every conservationist's life, but for me, bird watching at least holds out the promise that we can keep that balance between the human and the bird. At the same time, it is true that after I made my discovery that there were birds everywhere in Central Park and other parks in the city, there was a kind of corollary discovery to that, which is that it's a bit of an artificial profusion. One of the reasons there are so many great birds in city parks is because they don't really have very many places to land. It's these green spaces that attract them. And so it's kind of important at the same time to think about the other elements in the life of a bird. And in the same way that most cities, or a lot of cities, have sister cities in other countries, I feel like every park should evoke in your mind a sister spot, some wood or meadow or swamp or mountaintop, where the birds that you see on migration go to breed, and another sister spot where they spend the winter. The cerulean warbler spends the winter in places like Colombia or Venezuela, Peru, and right now, or Bolivia, where they're cutting down the tall trees that the bird needs and planting coffee. So if that keeps happening, and I'm not mindful of that sister region, I won't be seeing the cerulean at 100 West 89th Street or anywhere else. And so it's important, and this is something I love to tell the children I take birding, that you follow the bird with your mind. You hardly have to leave home to go bird watching. It really can happen almost anywhere, but by the time you're done following it to its winter grounds and its summer, spring grounds, your mind has kind of encircled the whole world. Because bird watching is like politics. It's all local. It always happens in somebody's backyard. But simultaneously it is, and really needs to be global. That's my daughter, wrong direction. Sorry. Just what I said, I don't want to be one of those people who, but never mind, I'm not. Okay, this is a Scots oriole. And this is the last. This will not just be, great birds I have known, but this is another bird that I saw in Manhattan. I should not have seen it in Manhattan. I should not even have seen it in New York State, because it had never been seen in New York State before when it showed up a couple of years ago. And it should be in California. It's a western bird. And it didn't even show up in Central Park or Riverside Park. It showed up in Union Square Park, which, if you know Manhattan at all, is little more than a glorified traffic island. But there it was, blown off course. And I, of course, took a subway to see it, because for me it was a rare bird. And I realized on the subway with my binoculars I was somehow almost a little embarrassed. And I realized I was still ruled by fantasies of nature as something exotic, something out there and separate from you, which it isn't. But for me, it was as if I were taking a taxi to a safari, let me off near the wildebeest. I mean, there was something so unromantic about it. And I discovered that I need to accommodate myself, and I feel like we all need to accommodate ourselves to that experience, which it's not a false experience of nature. This bird is as wild an animal as a lion or a tiger. It is a wild animal, and I saw it in the middle of a great city, just as you can do here in this city. And birds are the last wild animals that we can see almost anywhere in this country. People sometimes say to me, how come you watch birds in the park? And I always say, well, if buffalo or caribou migrated through the park, I would absolutely go see them. But they don't. And the reality is that birds are in many ways all that's left in abundance of that wild world. It's a thrilling fact, but it's also, of course, a melancholy fact. So now I want to switch. It's time for a human being. And I want to tell a parable of sorts about this man, although it's also a true story. And it's a story of John Burroughs, who I hope some of you know about, but it's possible you don't. He was at one time the most famous nature writer in America. In the late 19th and early 20th century, he was the most famous naturalist, most famous nature writer, much more famous than Thoreau, who was really in eclipse and obscurity then. He looks like Walt Whitman in this picture. He's kind of consciously done that. He was a friend of Walt Whitman's. And in fact, Walt Whitman has a beautiful poem about a mockingbird out of the cradle endlessly rocking, has beautiful descriptions of the bird, its call, its eggs. All those descriptions come from Burroughs, who wrote one of the first biographies of Whitman. He was so popular that Houghton Mifflin, his publisher, created an imprint just for him. He was born in the Catskills, and he lived most of his life there. And he spent a lot of time living here on his property, a little place he called Woodchuck Lodge, and in the western Catskills. But despite his rural and local life, he was valued greatly and admired by men like Teddy Roosevelt, who took him camping to Yellowstone, and he was also admired by Henry Ford, the automobile manufacturer, who lived here. But Ford had grown up on a farm, and just like Burroughs, and he was deeply sentimental about rural America and about the natural world, and he revered Burroughs, and reading Burroughs had made him actually something of a bird watcher. And he went to visit Burroughs. It's not a great picture, but you get the idea. Burroughs is the bearded guy on the left, and Ford is on the right. And you can see Woodchuck Lodge in the background. And then Ford did something really shrewd and bold. And what he did was, in 1912, he sent Burroughs a car as a gift. It came along with a driver to teach Burroughs how to drive. It was one of the first cars in the Hudson Valley. The reason it was shrewd and bold is because Burroughs said things like, "One cannot but reflect what a sucked orange the earth will be in the course of a few centuries. Our civilization's terribly expensive to all its natural resources." He also hated cars and referred to them as devils on wheels. But he fell in love with the car. And he began driving it all over the Hudson Valley, nearly killing himself. He drove through a barn, he almost went off a cliff, he turned over. I love this picture also. It looks like the egret from the first picture is somehow behind the wheel now, and they are moving in the same direction. And then because Burroughs discovered what everyone with a car discovers: you can go lots of places. And if you love the natural world, especially if you live in a world where you mostly get places on foot, you can see more of it. And that's what Burroughs liked.